thought.
And legal definitions also change. Now, legal definitions don't necessarily follow common usage, do they? And I know you were talking, Nick was talking the other day about Bill Clinton when he was being asked about the Monica Lewinsky affair, and hints on which definition of the word "is" you are using. And it does. It really does. And I think that's when you can be canny, and I think it's when you can be particularly
most of the legislation
deceitful.
and acts have got definitions written into them of most of the way that they see the words to be used.
Well, very few definitions. There's a Definitions Act, isn't there?
Interpretations, I think they call it rather.
It's interpretations.
Yeah, I've got it on my page here somewhere. But they do change.
Interpretations are open to interpretation.
Well, that's exactly it. It speaks volumes just calling it the interpretations, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes. Why, for example, is Oxford English Dictionary not used globally everywhere? Because then everyone would have a fair chance of understanding what any given word means at any given time. But for example,
because there's a Monopolies Commission.
Well.
I don't know.
Oh, there's always one, isn't there? It's always you. Thank you so much for that. That really helps. But the definitions in legal dictionaries change too. If you look at previous versions and previous printings of words, they have changed.
I've got 9 editions of Black's, and if you look at the definitions of one word in number 1 and the same word in number 9, there's very little similarity to the definition at all.
So I think we can understand it does make sense that words are added to usage. Words are added to dictionaries all the time. I mean, the word chav, I would imagine, is in pretty much every dictionary. I doubt it's in a legal dictionary, but I imagine it's in now. It's common usage, but 15 years ago, possibly, it would never have been heard of. So, yes, we do add to our vocabulary, and we do also lose words that we don't use anymore.
And change the meaning.
Change the definitions. Yeah. In a legal sense, is law not supposed to be a fixed entity? Are we not supposed to know how it works?
We have a system whereby common law has an effect, so obviously it's evolving to some extent all the time as people bring up different scenarios. For example, in a domestic violence situation where you're not to contact anyone directly or indirectly, if you're dealing with somebody young, they will be told that includes social media, Twitter, and they can string off a whole list depending on how savvy they are, which usually only goes as far as Twitter and Facebook, because that's what most people over about 30 are aware of, not all the others. But I mean, nobody would have been mentioning social media, nobody would have known what it was 15 years ago. No,
fair enough, but do they actually need to mention that? If they say that you are not to communicate with in any way, would that not just encompass it? Do they have to be specific? Because therein lies loopholes, doesn't it? Like you say, there are things that can be left out. If you start to make a list, it's never going to be complete.
In some scenarios, they're trying to be helpful to spell it out to somebody who perhaps doesn't realise that would be deemed to be communication. They're thinking, again, you come down to an interpretation of what something means.
That's right.
Communication to some people is just talking to them, whereas other people would assume that would be writing a letter. Now people will be expanding it to Facebooking them, Skyping them, using all sorts of other media, not just a simple picking up a telephone and ringing them up or sticking a letter through their door. So in some instances it's meant to be helpful, but of course interpretations can lead you astray if you do start to put in you shall not use this and this, because there's so many other
well, you didn't actually mention so I've done that.
So that's fine. And then
you didn't mention carrier pigeon, so
then somebody like me comes along and says, well, actually he's not in breach of that because you didn't include that in your list.
But then there's this principle with judges to look at what the legislation meant. When they will look at it first of all and say, what does this legislation say? Is it clear? Can we give it the common meaning? And then I'm sure you remember from learning law, it was the argument that if they say about apples and if they say about oranges and lemons and limes and other fruit, and if you come along and use a pear, then the judge will say, well, actually we didn't mean that because we're talking about citrus fruit, because they have quoted oranges and lemons and limes. So there is this presupposition of what the legislation was supposed to mean. But yes, it leaves it a very grey area, doesn't it? And like you mentioned, common law.
I was reading this morning that the use of mobile phones, especially by motorists, and the risks to cyclists and other road users. And there was a case that was brought against Jimmy Carr, the comedian, who was using a mobile phone stopped by the police, and he said he was using it as a dictating machine in order to record a joke.
Right.
And so he paid Mr. whatever he is, Mr. Motoring, lawyer, to represent him, no doubt at vast expense, and got off because the use of the mobile phone was not one that the courts had in mind.
I think the truth was he got off because he paid a lot of money.
Well, there is that, and sadly that's the way the government's going. The more you can afford to pay, the more likely you'll be able to get off.